woke up with my face pressed against hard, cracked earth, my mouth dry, and the pounding in my head was the kind of pain that dragged you out of sleep like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. It wasn't the worst headache I'd ever had, but it was close, the kind that made your vision blur and your stomach twist like you'd been spinning in circles for too long. The ground beneath me was rough, cracked, and cold, and when I forced myself onto my hands and knees, it felt like gravity itself was working against me. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, and slowly a field came into focus. It stretched endlessly in every direction, barren and lifeless, with patches of jagged rocks, and a few skeletal trees dotted the horizon like ghostly sentinels. Above, the sky burned crimson, an oppressive shade that made it feel like the air was thicker than it should be. Far ahead, a faint shimmer of white light flickered in the distance, too far to offer any comfort. Not far from me, a man was crouched, clutching his head like he was trying to hold it together. He wore a disheveled suit that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. His breathing was shallow, his shoulders rising and falling in quick, jerky motions. "Hey," I called out, my voice hoarse. "You good?" He didn't respond. His hand stayed pressed to his head, his fingers digging into his scalp like he thought he could claw his way out of this place. I inched my way towards him. "Do you know where we are?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. "What's going on?" He glanced up at me, his face pale and damp with sweat. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes darted past me, wide and wild, and his whole body tensed like a coiled spring. "What is it?" I asked, turning to look behind me. That's when I heard it. It was a low, guttural sound that seemed to shake the air itself, like a deep horn blaring from every direction at once. My stomach dropped as the sound rolled over me, impossibly loud and so sharp it felt like it was slicing through my skull. I turned in the direction the man had run, just in time to see them emerge. The creatures burst out of the shadows at the edges of the field, their forms shifting as they moved, long, gangly limbs that shouldn't have been able to carry them so fast. Their faces reflecting the crimson sky, and their movements were unnervingly smooth, like they were gliding over the ground. They closed the distance to the man in seconds. I watched, frozen, as the creatures surrounded him, their claws flashing in the crimson light. His screams cut through the trumpet's blare, high and desperate, before they were drowned out by the wet, tearing sound of flesh being ripped apart. I turned away, bile rising in my throat, but the image was burned into my mind, his body crumpling under the weight of the attack, blood pooling on the cracked earth. I felt my legs twitch, my body screaming at me to run. I gestured to stand up, ready to bolt, but then a hand clamped down hard on my arm.
"Don't fucking move,"
a voice hissed, low and sharp. Slowly I turned my head and saw her. She crouched beside me, her face impassive but her grip firm. Her dark hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her eyes were locked on the creatures. She didn't look at me as she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper.
"Just watch."
"What?" I started, but she cut me off with a sharp shake of her head.
"Shut up,"
she whispered.
"Just watch them."
I swallowed hard and nodded, too terrified to do anything else. My legs shook as I forced myself to stay rooted in place. The creatures prowled the field, their heads tilting unnaturally as they sniffed the air. One of them passed close, so close I could see the ridges of its jagged claws, and I held my breath, feeling like even the sound of my heartbeat might give me away. The trumpet faded, the echoes lingering for a moment before the silence returned, heavier than before. The creatures retreated, dragging the man's lifeless body into the shadows. She let go of my arm, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. My hands trembled as I tried to process what I'd just seen.
"They'll come back,"
the woman said flatly, her voice pulling me out of my daze.
"Next time, don't think. Just stay still." I
looked up at her, trying to form words. What What the hell is this place? She sighed, her gaze scanning the field, like she expected the creatures to reappear at any moment.
It's survival,
she said, like that explained everything.
You don't move when the trumpet sounds. That stops them.
What were those things?
Does it matter?
Yes, it matters. What is this place? Why are we—
Questions aren't going to help you,
she said, cutting me off. Her cold eyes met mine.
If you survive long enough, you may just figure it out.
She turned and started walking toward a faint light in the distance, her movements calm and deliberate. Wait, I called, scrambling to my feet. What happens if we don't keep moving? She paused, glancing back at me. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that made my stomach twist.
You get swallowed,
she said simply, gesturing toward something behind us.
And trust me, you don't want that.
I looked over my shoulder. There was a creeping black void spread across. It looked alive, its tendrils reaching hungrily across the ground looking for prey. I didn't know what it was, but every instinct in me screamed to keep away from it. I hurried after her, my legs still shaky. What's your name? I asked, my voice weaker than I'd like.
Why do you care?
She replied without looking back. I had no answer. I just kept following her, keeping my distance, unsure if she'd welcome me walking too close. Her steps were steady, purposeful, but her shoulders stayed stiff, her head darting occasionally toward the edges of the field. I didn't know where she thought the danger would come from next, but her watchfulness was infectious. I found myself glancing around too, my breath catching every time a shadow shifted. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our footsteps on the cracked ground. I hated the quiet. It gave my mind too much space to wander, to think about the man I'd just seen ripped apart, to wonder what I had done to end up here. What's that light ahead? I asked, my voice cracking slightly under the weight of my own question. I'd been staring at it for what felt like hours, and it only seemed to pull at me more. She didn't stop or even glance my way.
It's what everyone keeps walking toward,
she said, her tone unreadable.
A finish line, maybe.
Maybe? I pressed, frustration creeping into my voice. That doesn't sound very reassuring. What if it's something worse? She finally slowed, just enough to throw me a look over her shoulder. Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile.
That depends,
she said, her voice laced with quiet venom.
Do you think there's something better waiting for you?
I hesitated, the knot in my stomach tightening. What are you trying to say? I muttered. No one deserves this place. She let out a low, humorless laugh.
Deserve?
She said, her tone sharp and cutting.
That's a funny word to use in a place like this.
Her words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she glanced back toward the horizon.
Keep walking. You'll find out soon enough.
I frowned, trying to shake off the weight of her words. I don't even know why I'm here. I don't remember anything about how I got here.
Convenient,
she said, folding her arms and turning to face me fully now. Her eyes narrowed slightly, sharp and unyielding.
It's funny how people forget the bad parts when they're desperate to escape.
And you remember everything then? Every little detail about why you're stuck in this hell? She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing in a way that made me feel small.
I remember enough. Some people don't need to wonder why they ended up here. They already know.
Her hand brushed against her wrist, almost like a reflex, before she shoved it into her pocket. The movement was so quick, I almost missed it.
That's the difference between us,
she said.
You're still trying to fight it. I'm not.
Just then we passed another group of people, clustered together like frightened animals. 2 men and a woman, all pale and gaunt, their faces etched with the kind of fear that makes you stupid. One of them looked up as we passed, He didn't speak, didn't even acknowledge us beyond that brief glance. I thought about stopping, asking them what they knew, but the woman didn't slow, and I didn't dare fall behind.
"They're dead already,"
she murmured beside me. Her voice was cold, distant, as if she'd already decided their fate.
"They probably deserve it as well."
"We can't just leave them," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. My gaze lingered on the woman in the group. Her lips were trembling, her hands clawing at the thin man's arm as though she thought he could save her. He looked worse, his eyes wide, his breaths shallow, his legs shaking like they were about to give out.
"We can,"
she replied, not slowing her pace.
"You're no hero."
The trumpet blared. It was a deep guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My legs locked up and my breath caught in my throat. The woman beside me froze too, her head tilting slightly as her eyes darted toward the shadows. The creatures emerged like they'd been waiting. Their movements were slow at first, almost lazy, as though they weren't in any hurry. Their bodies were elongated, twisted, their limbs too long and their eyeless faces tilting unnaturally as they moved. They prowled toward the group, circling them like wolves sizing up a flock of sheep. "They're toying with them," I whispered, horrified.
"That's what they do. They like to make you break first."
The taller man panicked first. His breathing grew ragged, his chest heaving as his head whipped back and forth between the creatures and the void. Then he bolted, running toward a cluster of jagged rocks, like they could somehow shield him. 2 creatures were on him before he made it 10 feet. They didn't kill him immediately. One slammed into his side, sending him sprawling to the ground, while the other grabbed his leg and dragged him back toward the group. He clawed at the dirt, his screams echoing across the field as they pulled him closer to the void. No one dared to move. His companions stood frozen, their faces masks of paralyzing terror. The woman in his group crumbled to her knees, her sobs muffled against trembling hands that seemed to shield her from the horror unfolding before her. The thin man twitched, as if his body yearned to act, but his legs betrayed him, locking in place like iron weights. Fear radiated from them all, thick and suffocating, as though the very air conspired to hold them still, to force them to witness the inescapable fate closing in on the man. The tall man's screams echoed across the field, raw and desperate, as the creatures dragged him closer to the void. He thrashed wildly, his hands clawing at the cracked ground, dirt and blood smearing beneath his fingers. His eyes bulged with terror, his mouth open in a silent scream that seemed to stretch the air itself. The void's tendrils coiled around him, first his arm, then his torso, tightening with an unnatural, deliberate force. His movements grew frantic, each twist and struggle filled with a futile energy that only deepened the inevitability of his fate. The void seemed to inhale him, pulling him into its depths piece by piece. His screams turned into wet, choked gurgles, then silence as the tendrils claimed the last of him. The thin man's paralysis broke. He turned and ran, his movements erratic and desperate as he bolted toward nowhere. 2 creatures chased him, their long limbs propelling them forward with an unnatural grace. He didn't get far. One creature grabbed his arm, yanking him back, while the other clamped its claws onto his leg. He screamed, twisting and flailing as they pulled in opposite directions. The creatures didn't stop, their claws digging deeper as they began to tear. His screams turned into an agonized wail as his body was ripped in 2, his blood splattering the cracked ground in thick, dark streams. The creatures didn't pause to feed. They left his remains where they fell, turning their attention back to the remaining woman. The woman was sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking as she clung to herself. She didn't run, didn't move. She just stayed frozen, her eyes squeezed shut as though she thought that might make the creatures disappear. One of the creatures crept toward her, its claws tapping against the ground like the slow, deliberate ticking of a clock. It leaned in close, its head tilting to the side as though studying her. Then it slashed at her arm. Not enough to kill, just enough to draw blood. She screamed and stumbled back, but didn't run. The creature lashed out again, slicing at her leg this time, sending her sprawling to the ground. It hovered over her, its mouth opening wide as it let out a low, guttural growl. She crawled backward, sobbing, but another creature blocked her path. They surrounded her, their claws raking against the ground, their eyeless faces tilting as though they were enjoying her terror. They took their time, slashing and biting, tearing pieces away as she screamed, and just before they could deal the final blow, the trumpet stopped. The creatures retreated, leaving the woman bloody, alive but barely conscious. "She's not dead."
She's dead where it matters. Look at her.
I hesitated, the dying woman's faint, gasping breaths making my chest ache. Her bloodied hands clawed at the dirt, her eyes wide with terror, but unfocused, as though she couldn't even see us anymore.
You want to save her? Go ahead, but I guarantee you'll regret it.
What's wrong with you? She's still alive.
Alive doesn't mean worth saving. She's already broken. They've made sure of that.
We kept walking, the light ahead flickering faintly, a distant beacon that felt further away with every step. She moved with the same deliberate pace, her shoulders stiff and her gaze flicking occasionally to the shadows at the field's edge. I hated how calm she seemed, how unaffected. It made the knot in my stomach twist tighter. Do you think it's real? That light?
It's real enough.
That's not what I meant. Do you think it's an answer? Or just the end of the questions?
That light? It's not salvation, if that's what you're hoping for. It's just not this.
Her gaze flicked to the void, the tendrils writhing hungrily across the ground.
You saw what happened to the tall man. Anything's better than that.
The light was close now, so bright and vivid it painted everything around us in pale, ghostly hues. It pulsed rhythmically, like it had a heartbeat of its own, pulling us closer with every flicker. My body felt heavy, the ground beneath my feet dragging at me, as if it knew I wasn't meant to make it. She walked ahead of me, her pace steady, but her shoulders stiff. The silence stretched between us, a taut string waiting to snap. I couldn't keep it in any longer. You talk like you know me, not just people like me. Me. She stopped, her head tilting slightly, before turning to face me. Her expression was cold, unreadable.
I don't talk like I know you,
she said quietly. Then, after a beat, her voice sharpened.
I do know you.
The weight of her words hit me like a blow. What are you talking about?
I know what you did.
The words sent a chill through me. I tried. I always tried to do the right thing. Her lips curled into a humorless smile.
Did you? Or did you just try not to get involved?
She stepped closer, her eyes boring into mine.
Do you even remember me, Jacob?
Hearing my name from her lips was like a knife to the gut. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. My thoughts scrambled for answers, but her name danced just out of reach, teasing and elusive. Her smile faded.
No? Of course you don't. Why would you? I was just another face you looked past, another problem you didn't think was worth solving.
Then it hit me. Her name crashed into me like a wave, dragging memories I had buried deep. The quiet girl at the back of my class. The one who sat with her head down, hiding bruises I pretended not to see. The one the other kids mocked relentlessly while I convinced myself it wasn't my problem. Rachel? I whispered, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. Oh God, Rachel, I didn't know.
Don't! Don't you dare lie to me! You fucking knew! You always knew!
I didn't know it was that bad. I thought you'd get through it. Her eyes narrowing with a venomous glint.
You didn't think. That was the problem. You just wanted it to go away. And it did. I did.
Her words lingered in the air, heavy. She stepped closer, her gaze piercing through me.
You might as well have held my hand while I did it. You stood there, watched me drown, and handed me the weight to sink faster.
I stumbled back, her accusation striking deeper than I thought possible. She didn't stop, her gaze sharp enough to cut.
Maybe this place is hell,
she said, her voice low but heavy with meaning.
Or maybe it's justice. I haven't decided yet.
The trumpet blared, louder and longer than ever before, shaking the ground beneath our feet. The shadows around us churned violently as the creatures emerged. They didn't slink forward this time. They surged, their elongated limbs propelling them across the field with terrifying speed.
They're not stopping,
Rachel said, her voice trembling, clearly terrified. Stay still, I hissed, the command as much for myself as for her. My legs trembled, instinct screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to remain rooted in place. The creatures barreled toward us, their claws tearing into the cracked earth, their distorted forms flickering in and out of the shadows. One of them let out a guttural growl, its head snapping toward us like it had locked onto its prey. They don't want us to reach it. Rachel didn't respond. She just turned and broke into a run, sprinting toward the light with everything she had. The creatures surged forward, their movements erratic and unnatural. One of them swiped at me, its claws grazing my arm, and I stumbled, biting back a cry. Rachel didn't slow. She didn't flinch. We reached the threshold, the light warm and all-encompassing. The creatures hesitated, their forms flickering like shadows in the brightness, but they didn't retreat. They prowled at the edge of the light, pacing, snarling, waiting. The trumpet's call echoed again, deeper, mournful, and final. The void behind them pulsed like a living thing, its tendrils reaching hungrily toward the edges of the light. Rachel stood just steps away from the brightness, its glow illuminating her features with an ethereal light that made her look almost otherworldly. She didn't look at me. Her gaze stayed locked on the light, her expression unreadable. I tried to follow, but the light resisted me, an invisible force pressing against my chest, holding me back. I stumbled, falling to my knees, and for the first time, I truly understood. The light was never meant for me. Go, I said, my voice breaking under the weight of the moment. It's where you're meant to be. She turned slightly, her head tilting, but she didn't move toward the light.
You think this will fix it?
She asked, her voice quiet but cutting.
You don't get to feel good about this,
she said, her voice trembling at the edges.
You don't get to be the hero.
The creatures hissed, their movements quickening as they began to circle. The void's tendrils grew longer, writhing and twisting like they could sense my decision. I didn't flinch. I felt rooted to the ground, and my chest burned with something that wasn't quite courage, but wasn't fear either. Rachel stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine. Then she turned, stepping into the light. The glow enveloped her, her figure dissolving into the brightness until she was gone. The air shifted immediately. The warmth of the light faded, replaced by the oppressive cold of the void. The creatures stopped circling, their attention locking onto me. Their claws scraped against the ground as they advanced, their jagged teeth glinting in the dim glow of the crimson sky. I stood my ground, my fists clenched at my sides. The tendrils of the void reached me first, curling around my ankles, then my legs. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my bones, pulling me toward the endless blackness. The creatures followed, their claws digging into my flesh, their guttural growls reverberating through the empty field. I didn't fight. I didn't scream. I let them take me. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the same barren field where it all began. The crimson sky loomed overhead, vast and oppressive, the air thick and stifling. The light was gone. Rachel was gone. Only the emptiness remained. A figure stood before me, its form towering and grotesque. Its skin was charred and cracked, like molten rock cooled too quickly. Horns spiraled upward from its head, and its eyes burned like embers in the darkness. Its voice was a low rumble, like the ground splitting open.
"You stain this place with your cowardice,"
it hissed, its voice like grinding metal and splintering stone.
"Clinging to scraps of yourself as if they hold meaning, as if you matter."
It leaned closer, the air thickening with its presence, as though its contempt could smother everything around it.
"You're not just nothing,"
it said, its voice curling like smoke.
"You're the rot, the stain, dragging everything you touch into decay."
And then, with a cruel sneer, it seemed to look past me entirely.
"Even they see it now,"
it whispered, the weight of its words twisting the air.
"Don't they?"
I opened my mouth, but no words came. My throat was dry, the weight of its presence pressing me into cracked earth.
"You thought this was your choice?"
it hissed, its voice a jagged whisper, sharp and cutting, slicing through the suffocating air like shards of glass. Its form loomed closer, its presence crushing, an unbearable weight that pressed into my chest, making it hard to breathe.
"No,"
it murmured, the word dripping with malice, curling around me like a vice.
"You were always meant to crawl back, always destined to return to this pit you dug for yourself."
Its tone deepened, heavy with finality, reverberating through the ground beneath my feet.
"This is where it ends. This is where you've always ended. You feel it now, don't you?"
it hissed, its voice coiling with venom.
"The truth, sinking in like the knife you begged to pierce you."
I swallowed hard, forcing myself to hold its burning gaze, though the fear rising in my chest threatened to choke me. The creature chuckled, the sound jagged and guttural, reverberating like splintering stone in the hollow silence. Its gaze shifted, unnervingly direct, as though it was staring through me and into something, or someone beyond.
"Ah, there it is,"
it said, its voice dripping with cruel amusement.
"You're starting to see it now, aren't you? The weight of it all, the futility. You thought you were watching, but no, you've been part of this all along."
Its twisted grin widened, exposing teeth like fractured obsidian.
"You feel it too, don't you? That itch beneath your skin, the knowing you don't dare name. You never had a choice. None of us do."
It gestured toward the barren wasteland behind me, its movements slow and deliberate, like savoring an inevitable truth. The desolation stretched endlessly. Fractured earth, skeletal remains of nothingness, and shadows that writhed like living despair.
"This is what you are. This emptiness, this ruin. You don't belong to the light. You belong here, among the ashes of everything you failed to be."
I turned slowly, my breath catching as the void stretched before me. The vast emptiness gnawed at the edges of my mind, an unending reflection of everything I'd ignored. The weight of eternity pressed down, my legs trembling as if trying to resist what I already knew was inevitable.
"This is what a maggot like you deserves. Grovel here, in the filth of yourself, where you've always belonged."
I stood there, paralyzed, the truth sinking into me like cold iron. Then, without a word, I stepped forward, the ground beneath my feet cracking as the wasteland opened its arms. My steps grew slower, heavier, until the emptiness engulfed me completely. The creature was right. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't retribution. It wasn't cruelty or mercy. This was me, forever.